Yes. And so that's the very beginning of that this book is about perspective, and that their perspective, especially Jane's perspective, is going to be a little different.
What a beautiful day.
It is a pretty day.
I want to be out.
Finally, right?
Everything looks cleaner and brighter when the sun's
does.
out, just like Jane says.
If you're upside down.
If you're upside down.
And backwards.
Well, when I first started reading the Moffats, the first time I read it, I kind of shrugged it off. It was one of those where it was just little episodes, episodic in nature, and I didn't quite understand the value that I know that you guys placed upon it, because I'd heard you talking about the Moffats, and I knew that we were really investigating it deeply. So then I read it again, and then I actually read it again, and the more I read it, the more I realized there's a lot of good stuff in this. And some of it just comes down to the quality of the writing. So often, I think in these early grades, when we're reading these books, they're well written to an extent, but obviously they're written to an age group where you can't be very lyrical all the time. You know, you may introduce a simile or a metaphor once, and allow students to catch on. But I mean, this story just begins with the way Mama could peel apples. I mean, you haven't had an introduction like that, I think, yet, where it's just this kind of sudden drawing into the story. And so I began to enjoy the quality of the writing. And then as I was reading through some of our essential questions and thinking about them as I read the book, that's how I began to realize that this book requires contemplation. It's not just a book that we read for fun. It's a book that we read for contemplation. And that elevated the quality of the book in my eyes. And it made it a book that I actually enjoyed coming back to that third time.
First, you said that this book is deeper than it appears. And I think that this is a great book to use in terms of considering how Memoria Press approaches a book, as opposed to the way you might approach a book without a contemplative attitude.
Yes.
And so this book has so much to offer if you treat it, if you engage with it, and if you're looking for the valuable nuggets in this book. So to read this book closely is a very valuable experience. And so if you read this book for comprehension or just on a surface level for entertainment purposes, it's wonderful in that way. It is an enjoyable, entertaining book.
There's great scenes.
If you try to contemplate this book, there's plenty there to contemplate. And so, I've said this a million times, to complete a book is not to comprehend a book. To comprehend a book is not to contemplate a book. And this is a great book at the beginning of the curriculum to see the distinction between those two approaches to literature. And so I like that you said that and pointed that out, because I think, this could really alert the reader to that.
Well, and I think that's something that we ought to discuss is that to contemplate a book, yes, you need to read it more than once.
Right.
That's true. The first reading is
Right.
never enough.
Right.
And sometimes you can, and especially as you become a better reader, you can get quite a lot in that first reading, but it's the second, the third reading where you do see, oh, that scene, which was so silly, is some allusion to something else, that's some deeper.
And it's beautiful.
It's like teachers. The first year they teach something, it's not near as good as the third or the fourth year, because it keeps getting better and better and better.
And richer and richer. And a good book, is that book that has levels and meaning and, more to offer with every single reading. And, the other thing you said in your introduction, the way Mama peeled apples, a good writer with beautiful imagery, with, real things to say. And you might think, well, that's, what's so important about peeling apples? But it struck you, and it spoke to my children too. I was saying beforehand, a few years after one of my daughters read this book, we were in the kitchen together, and I was making something with apples, and she just, said, "The way Mama peels apples." That sentence lived in her heart.
That's right.
For years after reading this book. So there's something to that. There's something, magical about that writing, and that, really attached to my daughter, it attached to you, the exact same sentence. And so, I think that's something to point out too, that great books are beautiful in a way that maybe we can't even explain.
That's right. Something about good writing gets into the skin of our students and lives with them in a way that's beautiful. And that's the kind of thing we ought to be encouraging with them, is find the thing that really touches you in a way. And some of these essential questions we've talked about before, and that's the point. This book is carrying on some of the very same questions that we have talked about in Charlotte's Web and Little House in the Big Woods, Farmer Boy, and some of the others that we've done. And so let's get started with some of these. I think one of the better questions to ask at the beginning here is, how is home defined? How do you know when you're there? Where do we see that particular theme throughout this book?
Home, community, family.
That's right.
It's huge in this book.
Yeah.
But the context of it is 1941 is when it was published. So it is a small community in a safe neighborhood. And we see at the beginning that Jane is afraid of Chief Mulligan. He's, the big policeman around town. But by the end of that first chapter, they're good friends.
That's right.
And it's a community that looks after each other. And home is a safe place to be. And it's the ironic thing about it is the whole premise of the book is that their home is for sale.
That sign is up the whole time.
Right. Yeah. And they're in fear of losing their home because they're it's a single mother with four children. I forget Sylvie all the time. 4 children, and she's a seamstress trying to make a living to support her family, and the landlord decides to sell the house that they're renting
because times are hard.
And so it's going to affect them. And so, but home still is such a nice place for them to they always come back to it. They go out in the community and they always come back to it. And they don't judge each other. You know, when what's his name loses Joe. When Joe loses the money, and it's like their last dollar that he loses
to
get $5 to get coal.
Yeah.
And he loses it. And when he comes back home, they all just pitch in to help him find it. And Mama says, well, it's gone. If it's gone, it's gone. I'll just work overtime to make up for it. There is no judgment. She doesn't blame him. It could happen to anybody. And I think she really trusts her children in a way that I didn't trust much. She really does place, because I think she's a single parent in hard times, coming out of the Depression, and their father has died. So she's been through that when Rufus was a baby. So she's raised these 4 kids by herself for a while now, for several years. And I think she has to trust them because they have to be more mature. They have to do things that you wouldn't normally expect children of their age to do.
Well, and there's such a gratitude for, we started talking about home, and I think, in this book, there's such a love of that yellow house.
The yellow house.
And at the beginning, and perspective plays a huge role in this book. And so, the yellow house, which is the best house on the street because it's the only house where you can see both ends of the street. And so, which places the house, in a central place on the street, but also in the children's heart. And so I think there is sort of a relationship between the people in the home and the home itself. And so the home is representative of this love and, just the children's gratitude and just sunny disposition toward their place and their people, and, I think it's so easy to just look for debits in your living environment, but the Moffats look for credits always. They're always looking for credits, and they're always looking for the positive things, and they're not tallying up, the mistakes or the annoyances or the difficulties, but they're always, just keeping track of all the positive things. And they're just building a community of gratitude within their home, within their neighborhood, within Cranberry at large. And so perspective is just enormous in terms of just the joy with which this family operates.
Yeah.
I think it's all really summed up at the end when they're getting ready to move. And Jane in her head goes through all of the different things that happened in the home as she looks at it. And, she's sad to be leaving her home. And she says, they couldn't help feeling stunned. Rufus didn't remember living in any other house. He had learned to talk, learned to walk, and had 5 birthdays and 5 Christmases in this house. Jane had made paper dolls, studied through the 13 colonies in school, knew every inch of this house except the little used dirt cellar, and had flown down the stairs hundreds of times, even if it was just in her dreams. And Joe and Sylvie, though they remembered the old house across the way and remembered Papa too, they had always felt this yellow house would be theirs forever.
There's this beautiful line. I was hoping you were going to say it because it was something I wanted to bring up. But there's this beautiful line where as she's going to the new house, she realizes that yellow house will live on in her memory like a glowing ember. And that repeats a story that had the Joe story where he had lost the money for coal and a piece of coal had fallen out. But that's such a beautiful image that, yes, that particular place will live on in a way that's still kind of burning in her memory, and not burning in the sense of sorrow, but burning in the sense of warmth and home. That was a place. Because I think one of the key discussions of home in this book is that it is a place, not just people. And we sometimes like to be cute and talk about how, well, wherever you are, that's home for me.
Right, wherever your family is.
And yes, that's true. And there's a beautiful idea there, but there's also the reality that a particular place matters.
Right.
And
a place where you feel you belong.
A place, it's almost a holy ground kind of place, that this is sanctified to us. This is something that's devoted to us, and I think that's a beautiful thing. And when it does change, when that place changes, it can still be a memory. It can still live there and be a powerful, not just a dormant memory, but a burning. There's some energy to it there. It's still there in your memory, even when you go to a new place.
And, I think, and again, the symbolism of the yellow house, the burning embers, but also perspective. I mean, at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book, Jane is looking upside down and backwards.
That's right.
And so I think that, I think that gives us clear instructions at the beginning to pay attention to the perspective of this book. And so what you just said, this house is not grand. It's not, they're in difficult times, but the way that they look at it is just so adorable and wonderful. I mean, they live next to a brick lot, and they think
thrills them.
They think it's the greatest boon, and and so just the way that they're approaching their life and the gratitude and the way they see the thing,
very optimistic.
Yes, and it's just so sunny, and so it's perfect that the house is a bright yellow house in the middle of the street where you can see everything.
Well, that's related to another question that we've already talked about in several other books, but what does it mean to be part of a family or community? So this house is centrally located on this street that allows them to see both ways, and it's connected to neighbors that they grow fond of. So let's explore that. What does it mean to be part of a family or community?
It means they're safe.
That's right.
It means, that they can get in a wagon with the Salvation Army man.
Yes.
And lose
who is a stranger, but still recognized.
But because he was the Salvation Army man, he felt safe.
That's right.
To them. And the policeman is safe. And all of the neighbors, the man that runs or whoever runs the candy store, all of those people know them and know their community. And, we lived in a very small rural community. I don't know that this one's not really rural, but there was one town square, one grocery store, one drugstore, and everybody knew my children. They knew who they were because it was small. And so it was safe, because if I wasn't there, there were people there who knew who they were and would take care of them. And I feel like that's the world that has been created here. And I think that's a world that we've lost, sadly. But that is so valuable, that we would have a community of people that we belong to and who belong to us. Wendell Berry says, he calls it a membership.
That's right.
Your members together, your members one to the other. And I think that is beautifully created here.
The neighborhood is not, I mean, we've romanticized this neighborhood, but it is an authentic neighborhood too. I mean, there are so many interesting characters and eccentric characters, and Miss Chester, the dance instructor, and Captain Mulligan, the police officer. And Peter Frost, and there are
who's the bully? Like
that's
the
right.
bully.
Yes,
they do get the best of him,
that's right.
but it's at their own expense.
That's right. The Murdoch family who's investigating or inspecting the house and considering buying it, and there are some annoyances, and just genuine, real things about the neighborhood. It's not so wonderful to the children because it's perfect. It's so wonderful because of their attitude about these things.
But I mean, Joe having to dance, because I mean, just the fact that these children are taking dance class, that was considered important to Mama, and Joe having to do it. Miss Chichester was so she was like the bane of his life. I think he says that.
That's right.
But then he ends up dancing and is the star of the show.
He wasn't the star. The dog.
Well, the dog was, but he felt like
right.
He suddenly was enjoying it, and when she forgot to pay him his dime,
he went on whistling.
He was still happy.
It was
whistling
one of the best days
in the rain.
Right.
Whistling in the rain.
Right. Exactly.
Yes.
So it is a real community in the sense that
the children aren't always
danger.
happy
There's
with
still
their
Yeah. But the way, what makes this book so funny, I think, is the disconnect between the narrative perspective. So it's written with such an adult wisdom through the eyes of Jane. And so that gap in perspective is really the thing that makes it so funny. It's, for instance, Jane thinking Captain Mulligan is, terrifying. She thinks, Peter Frost has told her she's going to be arrested because she imitated him on the sidewalk. And so she's terrified of Captain Mulligan, who is charming and turns out to be a dear friend to her. Yeah. And she's hiding from him, and he says, well, and he comes to protect her. Who are you hiding from? How are you in danger? And she says, well, I'm hiding from you. And he just laughs. I mean, he just has this great, huge laugh. And, it's just such a warm, friendly, protective sort of experience. And, just that gap in perspective makes the book funny, but also it makes it real because, from a child's perspective, of course you might be afraid of, you don't know all, maybe that is a law that you don't know about.
That's right. That's right.
The children's innocence, contributes to a lot of worry. And so in that way, imagination plays two roles in this book. I mean, it's hugely important to the children, and you can see in so many of the episodes, imagination really serving the children well. So they're waiting, and there's just a neighborhood horse, and they imagine that it's a bridge, it's a Pegasus, it's the Trojan horse, it's all of these things that are imaginative and make the experience fun. The same situation with Jane in a bread box. She's got she's a princess. She's, all of these things that are entertaining her. But then in the same way, imagination, turns into fear when she is also imagining Captain Mulligan being a threat to her or being, trouble for her. And so, I think that's an interesting thing to point out to the children is that, imagination can serve us and punish us.
Yes.
Yes. And then he had wings and could carry her away. He was the wooden horse of Troy, and many men could step out of him. He was a bridge that she could walk under. Sitting up there on the hitching post, watching the horse and watching the horse, Jane repeated to herself, "The horse is a bridge for me to walk under, and I'm going to walk under." So she does.
And that's another great thing about this book. It is rich with allusions. So, even in just this conversation, we've talked about the horse of Troy and the Pegasus, but all of the music is, actual music that students can listen to. There
the sailor's hornpipe.
That's right. There are tons of references to poetry, to song, to stories. I mean, Cinderella, Little Bo Peep.
Little Match Girl.
She talks
that's right.
about
Little Match Girl. Robert Louis
times.
Stevenson poems. I mean, the things that the children are doing in this book, it's rich with sort of cultural literacy that the students can attach to and explore. So, those are things that a parent reader or a teacher wouldn't want to miss.
Well, we've been talking about this now for a bit, but this is actually one of our newer essential questions for this novel. And so I'd like to go ahead and just simply ask it and really explore some of these things about perspective that we've been talking about more deeply. So How does perspective contribute to contentment or dissatisfaction? We've already talked about this some, but let's explore that more deeply.
I think the original beginning, which is even on the cover of the book, is Jane upside down looking at the house.
That's right.
Because
what does that mean?
It's not a great house, but to her it is. And she says when she's upside down, looking at it upside down and backwards, that it looks clearer and brighter, cleaner.
Yes.
Cleaner and brighter, right?
Yes.
When the sun's shining on it.
Yes. And so that's the very beginning of that this book is about perspective, and that their perspective, especially Jane's perspective, is going to be a little different.
Well, and that's exactly, you've already mentioned this, but it bookends this book, because at the end, when they go to the new house, she does the same thing.
Right.
And she sees what seems to be an even more disappointing house in a new light.
Yes.
Right.
And the yard isn't so great, but
she finds a friend in the yard.
She does. And so we can't anticipate. I mean, it ends in such a hopeful way in that way, because we can see, well, this is how, the book started, and what a delight, what a loving place this was for her. And it leaves us with hope, because, Jane's approaching this new house with the exact same attitude the exact same perspective. And so we just know Jane's going to be fine.
That's right.
Yeah, she's kind of like Anne of Green Gables.
Yes.
Who can just turn.
She sees the world differently.
She does see it differently. And it's always, it always has a positive take.
That's right.
And you hope that Jane goes through her life without losing that positivity. But she's been through a lot. She's lost her father. They don't, she knows her mother is struggling, and she still is very positive. And there's a lot to be said for that.
When you read this book, you don't necessarily, until you read it 2 or 3 times, you don't necessarily see that thread of sadness that kind of hovers over this entire novel. I mean, the for sale sign is on the house
but
the entire
perspective
time.
Too.
And that's perspective.
Because what does she say?
Yeah.
As long as that sign's there,
that's
it's
right.
Not sold.
She sees it upside down.
Right. But, even in their sad times, they bond together. I mean, they go through scary things. I mean, scarlet fever, they've lost their last bit of money, but they have this share and share alike attitude. And it says this in the book, that they really depend on each other to get through their difficulties. And they have a genuine trust and loyalty to each other, which, as a parent is really heartening. I mean, it's, they're a great example of just a sibling love and loyalty that I think, parents would appreciate.
Yes, and perspective again, speaking of scarlet fever, so now they have 2 signs outside the house. Mm-hmm. One says scarlet fever, which quarantines them, and Jane says, well, as she's very sad. She's crying over the fact that Rufus is so sick. But she says as long as there is scarlet fever here, the house will not sell.
That's right. That's right.
So there's always a bright side. She always sees a bright side.
Well, I think Jane is a great character to introduce to students now. And one day they'll get to maybe a Chesterton novel like The Man Who Was Thursday, where the whole point of it is you have to look at God from a different angle. You have to look at reality from the other side, backwards and upside down. Right. And so you start with something like this, and you're prepared, you're prepared for The Man Who Was Thursday. That's you're prepared for any other of some of our favorite fantasy novels, or our favorite nonsensical writers who teach us that the world shouldn't only, it ought to be analyzed. You ought to look at it right side up.
Right.
But don't let that be it. You'll find some more maybe transcendent reality if you look at it upside down.
Well, and, bringing up Chesterton, I think he says something that's very helpful for this book. One of his quotes is, an inconvenience is only an adventure rightly considered. And so just considering, how we approach even our smallest inconveniences, well, this can be a grand adventure. And that's what you see in the Moffats. I mean, everything that happens to them, they accept with, great joy and excitement and a spirit of adventure. And even when it's difficult, there is sort of a humble forbearance. I mean, even in their lowest, experiences, they really do experience those things with, a really noble forbearance.
Like when Rufus and Huey, so Rufus goes to school, he's got this terrible dilemma because Mama has told him to stay there, and Mr. Penny
Pepper.
Mr. Penny Pepper tells him he has to look after Huey, who doesn't want to be in school.
And he takes that as a charge. It becomes his duty.
And so off he goes.
Yeah.
So he disobeys Mama because he has to take care of Huey.
That's
and they end up on this train adventure.
Yes.
Which they thoroughly enjoy until they realize we're far from home. But I know my address.
Yeah.
And so... But they never really, they just trust that they've got a friend, Bob, or whatever his name was, that he was going to take care of them and somehow get them back home.
Well,
their sense of adventure is amazing for Huey.
And for Huey, that becomes his entrance into school because now he's like, so do train engineers have to go to school? And Rufus is like, well, I think they do. And he's like,
he's going to school. He's got an incentive to be there.
That's right.
He didn't have an incentive before that.
And Rufus, the going to school is such an important. It's really in all of our books, and
he loved it.
He loved it.
The bright, shiny book, the pencils. He loved it. Right. And then he turns around and Huey's gone.
Yes.
And so, taking charge of Huey was such an unexpected.
Well, and Rufus was 5.
That's right. Well, and Rufus throughout has such a great. Some of his lines are just so wonderful because they really are maybe more than a 5-year-old, and I think that's some of the beauty of Essie's writing here. But it gives a sense of his perspective on the world. Mm-hmm. When you have the ridiculous scene of the 2 trolley men who are coming at it, they're coming, and the one older trolley man that they're on his trolley is so mad that the other guy just hasn't waited, so he takes it into his own hands. And Rufus says something like, "Well, they should just take it. They should go at it with pistols and swords or something." It's just hilarious. He just says the funniest things, and sometimes he'll say things that are wise beyond his years. They're sitting there on the Salvation Army's wagon, and Joe is trying to tell. They get into they go into a ditch or something like that, and Joe's trying to give Rufus instruction, and Rufus says, "Well, I've seen it done." Like he knows exactly what to do, beyond this. So.
Well, even in that experience, when they lose the Salvation Army man, when he falls out of the wagon,
yes,
it's really funny. But then they decide, okay, this is our duty to find him. We lost him. Now we have to find him.
Right. Yeah. They do really have a genuine sense of duty with all of
They do, because they leave a note for Mama where they are.
That's right.
Notes all over town, which then get washed away by the rain. Right. So Sylvie thinks they've joined the army.
Right. The way that they're approaching these adventures is with such entertaining seriousness.
Yes.
It's not just like, well, we have nothing to do today. And that's part of the fun. I think.
It is.
Well, and this relates to another essential question that we have discussed, and we've discussed it throughout some of our other books. Farmer Boy, I believe, Little House in the Big Woods. But what is the relationship between freedom and responsibility? Because I think that's what we're seeing here, is that they're
very free. Yes.
But they have a responsibility to each other.
They absolutely, and to their mother.
And part of it, I think, is the way Mother is so gracious with them, because she gives them responsibility. But when things don't go perfectly, she forgives them. She accepts the results with such grace, and so she gives them the leeway to make mistakes with that responsibility that she's given them. And I think she's a great example in that way. When they have a new responsibility, the way that she teaches them, is handling those mistakes and misfortunes really lovingly
and graciously.
Right.
Yes. One good example of freedom and responsibility is when Jane has the nickel that she got for going to get the dress sleeve for her mom.
Yes.
And then she does this whole thought in her head. She could get a piece of candy, and it would split evenly 4 ways, because in the Moffat household, it was share and share alike. And then she buys an ice cream cone instead, which obviously she can't share. It's going to melt, so she has to eat it. And then she just she's a pig. She's just nothing but a pig. And so she feels like she's taken her freedom and really thrown it away.
Yes. And
not used it responsibly. And then in the same chapter is when their cat has kittens, and she says, "Oh, and even she shares because she had 4 kittens, exactly what we needed." And so then she gets the favorite, she gets the one she wanted when they do the little thing to get the kittens. But then at the very end of the chapter, it says, even though she didn't deserve it.
That's right.
Because she had eaten the ice cream cone and not shared her nickel. So, there are lessons like that in here. And Jane is constantly learning them. But it's all done, it's all so loving.
Mm-hmm.
And they just love each other. And it's so obvious, their love and affection for each other. Even Sylvie, who is, older.
Yeah, she's not very often. She doesn't often appear. I mean, she does, but it's always background.
Right. She's really become just a helper for Mother.
That's right.
And while the other three are running around having their adventures, but even she accepts their shenanigans pretty well.
We've talked a lot about some of these adventures that they've had, and throughout this novel, one of our other essential questions deals with this spirit of adventure. And we've talked about the safety of their community, but we do need to temper that a little bit because some of these adventures that they have are a bit dangerous or turn on them in some way. And one of my favorite scenes where we see this is in the attic when they finally they get their vengeance on Peter Frost, and he kind of finally gets some of his own back at him. But in this scene, they've concocted this Halloween scene and this ghost in the attic, and they're so excited.
Which is their mother's dress
Which is
dummy.
their mother's, that's right. And they're so excited about getting Peter Frost, but what happens is at the very end, they do in fact get Peter Frost. He didn't believe in the ghost in the attic, but now he's terrified in this scene. And yet, who is it? Janey and Rufus are both crying at the end because they're so scared. So we see that
the cat gets
because the cat gets
up, that's they're all in the dark.
That's
so
right.
They scare themselves.
And so there is this satisfaction that we feel in this bully getting his comeuppance, but at the same time, there's risk. They ran the risk, and in fact, it did hurt them. So where else do we see some of this possible danger?
Well, Huey and Rufus on the train when they should be in school going to Boston, and they just happen to run into somebody nice who, the engineer, and was Bob the engineer?
I think his name was Bob.
And he helped them get back home, but there's no telling where they could have gone. Mama didn't know.
Yeah.
Mr. Penny, I don't know where Mr.
Pepper.
Thank you. Where Mr. Pennypepper, what he was thinking, because those boys were gone from school.
Yeah.
But that was dangerous.
Yes.
It ended up fine. And they, in their childlike way, had a great time. But they did have a moment where or at least Rufus did. I'm not sure Huey did. But Rufus had a moment where he did think, how are we going to get back? Is it going to stop? Are we going to end up in Boston?
Yeah.
And then what? So it was a great adventure to them, but in the end, they were afraid. And when they when the Salvation Army man fell out of the buggy, and they got lost, and they realized they were going round and round the town looking for him. Didn't know, you didn't want Mama to be afraid. All of those things were in that moment terrifying to them, but it all ended up fine.
That's right.
So it is, it's a very happy, kind of go-lucky environment that they're in throughout the book. But I think we would want to point out to children that that these adventures did have their downsides.
That's right. Well, I think it really comes back to perspective. I think this novel, I think that's probably the strongest of the themes that we're asking, and because in this novel, we've asked some of the same essential questions we've asked in the past, but we've really identified a few kind of new questions, and I think that perspective question is the most important, because here we have a text that for the first time is really teaching us to look at the world upside down. And what does that mean? It means looking at things that aren't often good and making them good.
And something that the author does in this book, speaking of perspective, the author depends heavily on imagery in this book as well. So for instance, she describes the mulberry trees in front of Captain Mulligan's house as standing erect like two soldiers guarding the front door. And so, if we're paying attention, all the way throughout, there is, such a beautiful compliment to the author's style and messaging in this book. So, the content and the style really complement each other well. And so there are plenty of examples of just beautiful imagery that give us a heightened sense of the importance of perspective, I think, in this book.